On January 26, 1942, at 12:15 in the afternoon, a crowd gathered at the edge of Belfast docks in Northern Ireland, watching a sight that would change their country forever. Through the grey winter drizzle, a massive troopship emerged from the fog. On its deck stood thousands of men in unfamiliar uniforms, their helmets a different shape, their equipment strange and new. Most in the crowd had never seen an American before. Britain had been fighting alone for over 2 years. The Blitz had killed over 43,000 civilians. Food was rationed, cities lay in rubble, and now, finally, the Americans were coming. Private First Class Milburn Henke from Hutchinson, Minnesota, was selected to be the official face of the American arrival. Though roughly 500 soldiers had already come ashore to begin unloading equipment, the army wanted a symbolic moment for the press. Henke walked down the gangplank multiple times so photographers could capture the perfect shot. As his brown boots touched the cobblestones of Belfast docks, a band struck up the Stars and Stripes Forever. Children waved tiny flags. Women cheered. The Duke of Abercorn, Prime Minister John Miller Andrews, and Lieutenant General Sir Harold Franklin waited to greet the arrivals. Later, at the railway station, Major General Vivian Magendie, the British officer commanding Northern Ireland District, inspected the new arrivals. He chatted with the soldiers, examined their equipment, and pronounced them a fine-looking lot of men. Women in the crowd remembered thinking the Americans looked like film stars. Tall and well-fed and impossibly confident, after years of grey rationing and blackout curtains and the constant fear of German bombers, here was something new, something that felt like hope. What happened over the next 3 years would reshape both nations in ways neither could have predicted. The initial optimism would give way to friction. The friction would transform into grudging respect, and that respect would eventually become something like love. But first, both sides had to discover just how different they really were. The British people who gathered at Belfast docks that January afternoon had certain expectations about their new allies. They had seen American films for years. Clark Gable, James Stewart, Humphrey Bogart, Cary Grant. They imagined all Americans would be like that, glamorous and charming and impossibly wealthy. They were about to discover that reality was far more complicated. The 4,058 soldiers who landed that first day were from the 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bull Division. They were mostly farm boys from Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. They had never been abroad before. Many had never left their home states. They spoke with accents that sounded nothing like the movies. They were confused by British currency, bewildered by British customs, and completely unprepared for British weather. Each soldier carried with him a 35-page booklet titled Instructions for American Servicemen in Britain, distributed by the United States War Department. The booklet attempted to prepare them for a country they knew nothing about. It was part practical advice, part cultural primer, and part warning. The British do not know how to make a good cup of coffee, the booklet informed them. You do not know how to make a good cup of tea. It is an even swap. It warned soldiers not to make fun of British accents, noting that you sound just as funny to them, but they will be too polite to show it. It reminded them that Britain had been at war for years, while America had only just begun. The British will welcome you as friends and allies, the booklet stated, but remember that crossing an ocean does not automatically make you a hero. There are housewives in aprons and youngsters in knee pants in Britain who have lived through more high explosives in air raids than many soldiers saw in first-class barrages in the last war. This was the first hint of a tension that would define the next 3 years. The Americans arrived believing they were coming to save Britain. The British had been saving themselves for a very long time already. They had survived the Blitz. They had endured Dunkirk. They had held the line when no one else could or would. And now these fresh-faced boys from Minnesota were arriving with big smiles and bigger expectations, apparently unaware that Britain had been fighting Hitler while America sat on the sidelines. The resentment began almost immediately, and it started with something very simple. The first weeks were a honeymoon period. The novelty of the Americans had not yet worn thin. British newspapers ran enthusiastic stories about the friendly invasion. Children followed the soldiers through the streets, fascinated by their strange accents and unfamiliar uniforms. Women smiled and waved. Men shook hands and bought drinks and talked about how together they would defeat Hitler. Some women in the Belfast crowd had remarked that they expected the Americans to be taller. The reality was that these were ordinary young men, not Hollywood stars. They were nervous and excited, just as uncertain about their hosts as the British were about them. When reporters asked Private Henke if he had a girlfriend back home, He told them her name was Iola Christensen. Maybe she is cracking up with some other guy by now, he added wistfully. But beneath the surface warmth, tensions were already forming. The Americans seemed unaware of what Britain had endured. They complained about the weather, the food, the blackout restrictions. They did not understand rationing. They did not understand queuing. They did not understand that when a British person said something was quite good, they meant it was excellent, and when they said it was not bad, they meant it was acceptable. The cultural miscommunications were constant and exhausting. Americans were loud where the British were reserved. Americans were direct where the British were indirect. Americans assumed that British politeness meant agreement, when often it masked profound disagreement. The British found American informality jarring, even disrespectful. Americans found British formality cold and unwelcoming. British officers assigned to liaise with American forces often found the cultural gap challenging to bridge. Working with the Americans, one later reflected, was like speaking two different languages that happened to use the same words. We said the same things but meant entirely different things by them. It took months before we learned to truly communicate, but all of these cultural frictions paled in comparison to the most fundamental source of tension: money. By the summer of 1942, the culture clash had begun in earnest. American troops were flooding into Britain at a rate of tens of thousands per month. They were everywhere, in small villages and major cities, in country pubs and London nightclubs, and they brought with them something the war-ravaged British had not seen in years. An American private earned $50 per month, plus an additional $10 allowance for personal items. A British private earned roughly 2 shillings per day, which worked out to approximately $12 per month. That 4-to-1 pay difference created resentment that festered throughout the war. The Americans had cash to spend, and they spent it freely. They bought drinks for everyone in the pub. They paid for meals that British workers could not afford. They purchased gifts that had disappeared from British shops years earlier. They had access to goods through their military post, exchanges that British civilians had not seen since 1939. Chocolate, chewing gum, nylon stockings, real coffee, white bread, fresh fruit, cigarettes by the carton. British children learned quickly. The phrase "any gum," chum became so common that it entered the English language as a symbol of that era. American soldiers would walk through villages trailed by crowds of eager children, each hoping for a taste of something sweet. The soldiers, many of them barely more than children themselves, handed out treats with generous abandon. To them, a stick of chewing gum was nothing. To a British child who had not tasted sweets in months, it was treasure. British mothers watched with mixed feelings: gratitude that their children were finally getting treats they could not provide, resentment that strangers could give what they could not, pride that would not let them admit how much those small gifts meant. The contrast extended to everything. American uniforms were better cut, made from finer cloth. American soldiers seemed healthier, their teeth straighter, their skin clearer. They had not spent years on wartime ration. They had not lived through the Blitz. Their country had not been bombed. Their families were not huddling in shelters, listening for the sound of German aircraft. If British civilians looked dowdy or badly dressed, the American guidebook explained, it is not because they do not like good clothes or know how to wear them. All clothing is rationed, and the British know that they help war production by wearing an old suit or dress until it cannot be patched any longer. Old clothes are good form. The explanation was accurate. Britain had introduced clothes rationing in June 1941. The initial allowance of 66 coupons per year had been steadily cut, first to 48, then by 1943 to just 36. A winter coat required 18 coupons, half a year's allowance. The British people were literally wearing their clothes until they fell apart, patching and mending and making do. The Ministry of Food ran campaigns with slogans like "Make do and mend." Women were taught to turn old curtains into dresses, to unpick worn sweaters and reknit the wool into new garments. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted. Food rationing was even more severe. By 1943, a typical weekly ration for one person included just 2 ounces of butter, 4 ounces of bacon, 8 ounces of sugar, and 1 shilling's worth of meat. Eggs were so scarce that dried egg powder became a staple. Fresh fruit was a distant memory. Bananas and oranges had disappeared entirely. British families had learned to stretch these meager supplies through ingenuity and sacrifice. They grew vegetables in their gardens through the Dig for Victory campaign. They raised chickens and rabbits in their backyards. They learned to cook meals that would have seemed unthinkable before the war. Woolton pie, named after the Minister of Food, was a pastry filled with whatever vegetables were available. Mock goose was made from lentils and onions. Eggless cakes became a household staple. And then the Americans arrived in their crisp new uniforms, looking like they had stepped out of a fashion magazine, with their mess halls serving real coffee and fresh eggs, and meat in quantities that British civilians could only dream of, but the most serious tension centered on something far more complicated than money or clothing or chewing gum. Women. The American soldiers arrived young, healthy, confident, and lonely. They were thousands of miles from home, facing an uncertain future. Many would be dead within months. British women had spent years surrounded by rationing and air raids and the constant fear of German invasion. Their own men were scattered across the globe, fighting in North Africa, or the Far East, or the frozen waters of the North Atlantic. Many of their men were simply dead, and now here were these exotic strangers who looked like movie stars and had money to spend, and knew how to dance the jitterbug. The jitterbug itself became a symbol of American cultural invasion. British dance halls had featured the foxtrot and the waltz, dignified dances with proper distance between partners. The jitterbug was wild, energetic, intimate. American soldiers would swing British girls through the air, holding them close, moving to music that seemed to pulse with a different kind of energy entirely. British women loved it. British men watched from the sidelines, seething. The relationships that formed became a source of endless friction. British servicemen, when they were home on leave, found themselves competing with Americans who had better uniforms, more money, and seemingly limitless confidence. A British soldier might save his pay for weeks to take a girl to the cinema. An American could buy dinner, drinks, flowers, and dancing without even noticing the expense. The bitterness crystallized into a phrase that captured the entire complicated relationship: overpaid, oversexed, and over here. The exact origin of the phrase is disputed. The British comedian Tommy Trinder helped popularize it in his act throughout the war, but most historians believe it emerged organically from pubs and factory floors across the country. Some versions included overfed as well, a reference to the American access to food that Britain could only remember from before the war. By 1943, everyone in Britain knew the phrase. It was repeated in newspapers, muttered in queues, shouted in arguments outside dance halls. It became the shorthand for everything the British resented about their new allies. The Americans had their own response. The British, they said, were underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. The joke acknowledged the pay disparity, took a shot at British Reserve, and reminded everyone that an American general, Dwight Eisenhower, was supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. Even British generals served under him. The retort was clever, but it did not ease the tension. The friction was real and persistent. Fights broke out in pubs and dance halls. British soldiers confronted Americans over women. Americans complained about British food, British weather, British Reserve. Letters home from American soldiers often painted Britain as grey, cold, dreary, and unfriendly. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Something that would ultimately prove more important than the resentments. On the evening of June 24, 1943, in the small village of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, a group of black American soldiers from the 1511 Quartermaster Truck Regiment sat drinking in a pub called Ye Old Hob Inn. They were sharing drinks with local villagers, British civilians who had become their friends over months of shared evenings. Around 130,000 to 150,000 of the American troops in Britain were African American. They served in segregated units, assigned primarily to service and supply roles rather than combat positions. They built airfields, drove trucks, loaded supplies, performed the essential logistical work that kept the war machine running. They were subject to the same Jim Crow laws that governed their lives back home, enforced by white military police who followed them everywhere. But Britain had no segregation laws, no separate drinking fountains, no back of the bus, no color-only sections in restaurants or theaters. For many black American soldiers, arriving in Britain was the first time in their lives they had been treated as equals by white people. The British people, for the most part, had never met black people before. Britain's population was almost entirely white. The few black residents, perhaps 8,000 in the entire country, were concentrated in port cities. Rural villages and small towns had never seen a black face. When black American soldiers arrived in these communities, the locals had no template for how to treat them. They had no history of segregation to fall back on. They simply treated them as they would any other soldiers, as allies fighting a common enemy. The writer George Orwell observed the phenomenon with characteristic sharpness. On December 3, 1943, in his Tribune column, he noted the tension between American soldiers and British civilians. American soldiers, he observed, were often resented as overpaid, oversexed, and overhere, but he qualified this with a striking observation. The general consensus of opinion, Orwell wrote, seems to be that the only American soldiers with decent manners are the Negroes. This was not just Orwell being provocative. Similar sentiments appeared across Britain. One farmer reportedly put it bluntly, "I love the Americans, but I do not care much for the white fellows they have brought with them." The people of Bamber Bridge had already made their position clear. When American military commanders attempted to establish a color bar in the village, demanding that pubs refuse service to black soldiers, the locals responded with defiance. According to local accounts passed down over the decades, some pubs in the village posted signs welcoming black troops while refusing service to white military police. While historians have debated whether these specific signs existed, the sentiment behind the stories was undeniably real. This was not a gesture of empty symbolism. It was a direct challenge to the American military's attempt to impose segregation on British soil. The villagers of Bamber Bridge had made their choice. They would stand with the black soldiers against the white military police. On that June evening in 1943, tensions that had been building for months finally exploded. Two white military police officers, Corporal Roy Windsor and Private First Class Ralph Ridgway, entered Ye Olde Hob Inn and attempted to arrest Private Eugene Nunn for a uniform violation. He was wearing a field jacket instead of his class A uniform, a minor infraction that white soldiers routinely committed without consequence. Local British civilians immediately intervened. "Why do you want to arrest them?" a white British soldier demanded. "They are not doing anything or bothering anybody." A fight broke out. Fists flew. The military police retreated to their vehicle, bloodied and humiliated, but they returned with reinforcements, more military police, armed with weapons. The situation escalated rapidly. Rumors spread through the black soldiers' barracks that their comrades had been shot. Dozens of men, furious and frightened, armed themselves from the base armory. For 5 hours, gunfire echoed through the streets of Bamber Bridge. Running battles played out between the military police and the black soldiers, with British civilians caught in between. When it was over, one soldier was dead. Private William Crossland had been shot in the back. Witnesses said a military policeman had killed him, though no white officer was ever charged. Several others were wounded. 32 black soldiers were court-martialed, with most receiving convictions on various charges related to the incident. But the outcome was not what the white military police had expected. General Ira Ika, commander of the 8th Air Force, investigated the incident and placed most of the blame on the white officers and military police. He cited their poor leadership, their use of racial slurs, their escalation of a minor incident into a firefight. The sentences of the convicted black soldiers were reduced. Several were returned to duty within months. The Battle of Bamber Bridge was not an isolated incident. Between November 1943 and February 1944, there were 44 similar clashes between black and white American troops on British soil. In Bristol, in Leicester, in towns and villages across the country, the same pattern repeated. White military police attempting to enforce segregation, black soldiers resisting, British civilians often siding with the black soldiers against their white countrymen. This was not because Britain was free of racism. The country had its own complicated history with race, rooted in centuries of empire. British colonial officials had enforced brutal racial hierarchies across Africa and Asia. British society contained its own prejudices and exclusions, but the British had never experienced American-style segregation. Systematic, legalized, violent enforcement of racial separation. They found it deeply offensive when Americans tried to impose it on their soil. The United States was supposed to be fighting for freedom and democracy. How could American soldiers enforce laws that denied those very principles to their own countrymen? The cognitive dissonance was profound. Britain was not innocent of racism, but watching American racism play out on British streets forced a reckoning. Many British people, encountering black Americans for the first time, found themselves confronting their own assumptions about race. The positive interactions they had with black soldiers began to challenge stereotypes they had not even known they held. The British government found itself in an awkward position. They needed American support to win the war. They could not afford to alienate their most important ally, over matters of race, but they also could not simply accept the imposition of American segregation on British soil. The compromise they reached was uncomfortable and imperfect. British authorities agreed not to interfere with American military segregation policies, but they refused to enforce segregation in British civilian establishments. Pubs, restaurants, and dance halls were free to serve whoever they wished, and most chose to serve black soldiers alongside white civilians. This created a strange dual reality. On American military bases, segregation was strictly enforced. Off base, in British towns and villages, black soldiers could drink in any pub, dance with any woman, walk down any street. The contrast was not lost on anyone. Research conducted decades later found that areas of Britain where black American soldiers had been stationed showed measurably lower levels of racial prejudice generations afterward. The presence of black soldiers and the positive interactions they had with local populations had lasting effects on British attitudes toward race. The historian Graham Smith, who extensively researched this period, documented how the encounter between Jim Crow segregation and British society created lasting ripples. British children who had played with black soldiers, British women who had danced with them, British families who had shared meals with them, all carried those experiences forward. The war had forced an unexpected confrontation with American racial policies that many British people found difficult to forget. A black American journalist named Roy Otley, writing in 1942, captured the strange liberation that many black soldiers felt in Britain. The British, he wrote, are inclined to accept a man for his personal worth. Thus the Negro has social equality here in more ways than theory. To put it in the language of the Negro soldier, I am treated so a man does not know he is colored until he looks in the mirror. For many black American soldiers, serving in Britain became a transformative experience. They saw what life could be like without segregation. They experienced being treated as men rather than second-class citizens. When they returned to America after the war, many refused to accept the old restriction. Historians have traced a direct line from the experiences of black soldiers in Britain to the civil rights movement that would transform America in the 1950s and 60s. As veteran Wilford Strange said in a documentary decades later, I think the impact these soldiers had by volunteering was the initiation of the civil rights movement. These soldiers were never going back to be discriminated against again. None of us were. As months passed and the American presence grew, the initial resentments between white Americans, British civilians also began to transform. Something unexpected began to happen. The sneering comments about Americans being overpaid and oversexed started to give way to something more complicated, a grudging respect that would eventually become genuine affection. The transformation happened in stages. First came the realization that the Americans were not just here to take. They were here to fight and to die. The United States Army Air Forces established bases across England, particularly in the flat agricultural lands of East Anglia. Over 200 airfields were built or expanded to accommodate the massive American air armada. Villages that had been sleepy farming communities suddenly found themselves surrounded by runways and hangars and thousands of young American airmen. The bases transformed local economies. Farmers sold eggs and vegetables to the Americans. Pubs near the airfields did booming business. Local girls found work as secretaries and telephone operators on the bases. The influx of American money revitalized communities that had been struggling through years of wartime austerity. By 1944, 1 in 7 residents of Suffolk County was American. The county had been transformed into a vast military staging ground. But the bases also brought death. Every day, the bombers took off on missions over occupied Europe, and every day some of them did not come back. The 8th Air Force began its bombing campaign against Nazi Germany in August 1942. American B-17 flying Fortress bombers flew from bases across eastern England, attacking factories and military installations in occupied Europe. The missions were dangerous beyond imagination. German fighters and anti-aircraft guns extracted a terrible toll. The losses were staggering. Over the course of the war, the 8th Air Force would lose more than 4,000 heavy bombers. Each aircraft carried a crew of 10 men. The mathematics of death were simple and horrifying. In 1943 alone, mission after mission ended in disaster. Black Week in October of that year saw nearly 150 bombers destroyed in just days. British civilians watched the bombers take off in formation each morning, hundreds of aircraft filling the sky with their thunder. and counted them as they returned, always fewer than had left. They saw the damaged aircraft limping home, engines smoking, wings torn by flak. They saw aircraft that did not make it to the runway, crashing in fields outside the bases. They saw the empty bunks in the barracks, the personal effects being packed up and shipped home, the letters being written to mothers and wives and sweethearts who would never see their sons and husbands and lovers again. The young American airmen who frequented the local pubs were not the arrogant invaders the British had expected. They were scared, homesick, far from everything they knew. Many of them were just boys, 19 or 20 years old, children really. They flew missions with survival rates that made each flight a game of Russian roulette. They knew the odds. They flew anyway. British civilians began to see these young men differently, not as overpaid, oversexed intruders, but as terrified kids doing a job that might kill them any day. The bravado that had seemed arrogant revealed itself as a coping mechanism, a way of facing death without being paralyzed by fear. Thousands of British families began opening their homes to American soldiers. Servicemen were invited to Sunday dinners, to Christmas celebrations, to weddings and christenings and birthday parties. The War Department had warned American troops about this possibility. If you are invited to eat with a family, the guidebook advised, do not eat too much, otherwise you may eat up their weekly ration. The advice was practical, but it revealed something profound about the British character. Families who had been living on tight rations for years were sharing what little they had with these foreign strangers. They were offering hospitality they could not really afford because they had come to care about these young men who might die tomorrow. The relationships between American soldiers and British women, initially a source of friction, began to produce something more lasting than resentment. By 1944, over 6,000 British women had married American servicemen. By the end of the war, that number would exceed 70,000. These were not just wartime flings. They were genuine partnerships that would last lifetimes. The courtships were unconventional by British standards. American soldiers were direct in ways that British men were not. They said what they meant. They pursued women they liked with open enthusiasm. British women, accustomed to the reserved approach of British men, found this refreshing and exciting, and the American soldiers, homesick and lonely, found in British women a warmth and connection they desperately needed. The transformation in British attitudes accelerated as D-Day approached. By the spring of 1944, over 1.5 million American troops were stationed in Britain. They were everywhere, filling every available barracks and camp and requisitioned country house. The southern coast of England was essentially one massive military base. The build-up was called Operation Bolero, and it was the largest movement of men and material in military history. Ships arrived daily carrying troops, tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, fuel, and thousands of other supplies needed to invade a continent. Entire regions of southern England were transformed into military zones. Civilians were evacuated from coastal villages to make room for training exercises. The army practiced amphibious landings on beaches that resembled Normandy. Tanks rumbled through country lanes. Aircraft filled the skies. The constant noise of military activity became the background music of daily life. Security was tight beyond anything Britain had experienced. Loose lips sink ships, the posters warned. No one was allowed to discuss military movements. Letters were censored. Telephone calls were monitored. The date and location of the invasion were the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The British understood what all of this preparation meant. The invasion of Europe was coming. These young Americans, who had arrived 2 years earlier as strangers, would soon be crossing the English Channel to face the German Wehrmacht. The beaches of Normandy awaited them. The hedgerows of France, the forests of the Ardennes, the fortified cities of Germany itself. Many of these men would not survive. On the evening of June 5, 1944, the soldiers began moving to their embarkation point. British civilians lined the roads to watch them pass. There were no cheers this time, no waving flags, no excitement. The gravity of what was about to happen was too heavy for celebration. People stood in silence, watching the trucks and tanks roll by, their faces somber. British civilians who witnessed those final hours before D-Day later described the gravity of the moment. They looked so young, many recalled. Just boys, most of them. And we knew we would never see some of them again. Some of them we had known for months, had fed in our homes, had watched dance with our daughters. And now they were going to die. The next morning, June 6, 1944, the invasion began. Over 156,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious assault in human history. The American forces landed at two beaches, codenamed Utah and Omaha. At Utah, the landing went relatively smoothly, but at Omaha, everything went wrong. The American casualties were concentrated at Omaha Beach, where the fighting was most intense. German machine guns positioned on the bluffs above the beach cut down the first waves of soldiers before they could even reach the shore. Landing craft were destroyed by artillery. Men drowned under the weight of their equipment. Those who made it to the sand found themselves pinned down with no cover. Over 2,000 Americans were killed or wounded in those first hours alone. News reached Britain by radio throughout the day. Families who had hosted American soldiers for Sunday dinners listened to the reports and prayed for men they had come to know. The phrase overpaid, oversexed, and over here suddenly felt petty, even shameful. These men were dying to liberate Europe. They were dying so that Britain would not have to face Nazi Germany alone. The journalist Ernie Pyle, who landed on Normandy Beach on D-Day +1, wrote about what he saw there. The bodies of American soldiers lay scattered across the sand, young men who would never see their homes again. Their personal effects littered the beach. Photographs of sweethearts, letters from mothers, Bibles and rosaries, the detritus of interrupted lives. The British read Pyle's dispatches in their newspapers and wept. Whatever resentments had existed seemed distant now, almost incomprehensible. How could anyone begrudge these young men their pay or their confidence or their success with Win? They had given everything. After D-Day, the relationship between Britain and America was never quite the same. The resentments did not disappear entirely. Cultural differences remained. The pay gap still rankled those who noticed it. But something fundamental had shifted. The British had watched the Americans fight and die alongside their own sons and brothers, and they could no longer see them as just loud, wealthy strangers who had come to steal their women and drink their beer. The war ground on through the Saar and fall of 1944. American troops pushed through France, into Belgium, toward Germany. The Battle of the Bulge in December brought another wave of casualties. The 8th Air Force continued its bombing campaign, losing men with every mission. Britain became a hospital as much as a staging ground, with thousands of wounded soldiers evacuated back across the Channel for treatment. British nurses cared for American casualties in hospitals across the country. British civilians visited military wards, bringing gifts and comfort to young men far from home. Friendships formed in the shadow of suffering. The divisions of the early years seemed distant now, almost from another era. When victory in Europe finally came on May 8, 1945, the celebrations mixed joy with exhaustion. The war had lasted nearly 6 years. Britain was physically and economically devastated. Cities lay in ruins. The national treasury was empty. The empire that had once spanned the globe was crumbling. But the country had survived. And it had not survived alone. The American troops began leaving almost immediately after victory was declared. The same ships that had brought them to war now carried them home. British families gathered at docks and train stations to say goodbye to men who had become like sons or brothers. The farewells were tearful and heartfelt. Addresses were exchanged. Promises were made to write, to visit, to never forget. The war brides prepared for their own journeys across the Atlantic, leaving behind everything they had known. The War Brides Act of 1945 would eventually bring hundreds of thousands of women from around the world to America, but the largest group came from Britain. In January 1946, the first ship carrying British war brides departed Southampton. The SS Argentina carried 452 women and 173 children across the Atlantic to begin new lives in a country most had never seen. The press called it Operation Diaper Run, a joking reference to all the babies on board. These women were taking an enormous leap of faith. They were leaving their families, their friends, their country, everything familiar. They were sailing to a land they knew only from movies and the stories their husbands had told them. Some of these marriages ended badly. Some American soldiers had lied about their circumstances back home. The palatial homes they had described turned out to be modest apartments or rural farms without indoor plumbing. The culture shock was severe. The loneliness could be crushing. Some eventually returned to Britain. Their marriages failed. Their American dreams dissolved. But many marriages endured for decades. The war brides built lives in America, raised children and grandchildren who carried both nations in their blood. They formed societies and clubs where they could connect with other British women who had made the same journey. They never entirely stopped being British, but they became American too. These women carried Britain with them across the ocean. They taught their American children to drink tea properly. They celebrated Christmas with British tradition. They kept photographs of the homes and families they had left behind, and they told stories about the war years, about the strange alchemy that had transformed strangers into husbands. The children of these marriages grew up caught between two worlds. They had American accents and British grandmothers. They ate peanut, butter, and Marmite. They celebrated Thanksgiving and understood Boxing Day. They were living embodiments of the complicated relationship between Britain and America. When war brides gathered at reunions decades later, speaking in accents that had become strange, hybrids of British and American, they marveled at the paths their lives had taken, all because of a chance, mating with a young soldier in a dance hall or a pub, in a country transformed by war. British women who lived through those years, when interviewed decades later, often captured the complex legacy in similar terms. At first we thought they were arrogant and flashy, they would say. They seemed to think they were better than us, with their money and their smart uniforms. By the end, we knew they were just boys, far from home, doing what they had to do. We were all in it together, really. Different accents, different ways, but the same war. The phrase overpaid, oversexed, and over here survived the war, but its meaning changed. What had once been spoken with genuine resentment became a kind of affectionate joke, a way of remembering a complicated time. British veterans would use it when telling stories to their grandchildren, always with a smile, always followed by stories of friendship and shared sacrifice. The statistics tell part of the story. Over 1.5 million American troops passed through Britain during the war. More than 70,000 British women became American war brides. Unknown thousands of friendships were formed, some lasting decades. The economic and military cooperation established during the war would become the foundation of NATO and the special relationship that continues to this day. The term special relationship itself emerged from this wartime alliance. Winston Churchill used the phrase in his famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946, just months after the war ended. He was describing something that had been forged in the crucible of shared sacrifice. Two nations that had discovered, despite their differences, that they could depend on each other when it mattered most. But statistics cannot capture the human reality of those years. The children who learned to say any gum, chum, and received their first taste of chocolate from a stranger's hand. The families who shared their rations with homesick soldiers who reminded them of their own sons fighting overseas. The women who fell in love with men from another continent and left everything they knew to build new lives. The civilians who watched the bombers fly overhead each morning and counted them home each evening, knowing that each empty space in the formation meant 10 young men who would never see their families again. The villages that stood up against American segregation to defend black soldiers they had come to respect. George Orwell, ever the sharp observer, noted a particular irony about the American presence in Britain. The Americans arrived believing they understood Britain because they shared a language. The British assumed the same about Americans. Both were wrong. They were separated by far more than an ocean. Different histories, different customs, different assumptions about class and race and behavior. But they were also united by something more powerful than their differences, a common enemy, a shared purpose, and eventually a mutual respect forged in the fire of war. The legacy of those years can still be found if you know where to look. In the small villages of England, where elderly residents remember the American soldiers who were billeted in their homes decades ago. In the war bride societies that meet annually in cities across America, women now in their 90s who made that long journey across the Atlantic more than 70 years ago. In the military cemeteries that dot the English countryside where America dead rest in British soil, tended by the country they helped to save. In Bamber Bridge, a memorial garden now stands opposite Ye Olde Hob Inn, commemorating the events of June 1943. The pub itself still operates today, a grey-to-listed building dating back to 1616. Its walls still bear marks from that violent night. Local historians have worked to ensure the story is not forgotten that. The Battle of Bamber Bridge remains part of the village's memory, a reminder of what happened when American racism met British resistance. The American presence in Britain during World War II was never simple. It was marked by friction and friendship, resentment and respect, cultural collision and unexpected connection. The British who lived through it remembered both the frustrations and the bonds. They remembered the loud Americans who did not understand queuing and the quiet Americans who died on the beaches of Normandy. They remembered the arrogance and the generosity, the cultural insensitivity and the genuine kindness. In the end, What the British thought of America during World War II cannot be captured in a single phrase, not even one as memorable as overpaid, oversexed, and over here. They thought many things, and those thoughts changed over time, shaped by experience and sacrifice and the slow work of understanding. What remains more than 8 decades later is the knowledge that two nations found a way to work together despite their differences. They argued and competed and resented each other, and then they fought and bled and died together. The friendship that emerged from that crucible, imperfect and complicated, would shape the next century of world history. The crowds who stood at Belfast docks in January 1942 watched the first Americans arrive could not have known any of that. They saw only strangers in unfamiliar uniforms stepping onto their country's soil. What those strangers would mean to Britain, and what Britain would mean to them, would only become clear in the years of war that followed. That is what the British thought of America during World War II. Not one thing, but many things. Suspicion giving way to understanding. Resentment melting into respect. Strangers becoming allies, and allies, against all odds, becoming friends. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.